This is The Extra Mile.
All right, enough is never enough. After all, the show is all about going the extra mile.
That's right.
Go the extra mile. I think Roy and Newman got more scriptures, more stories, more things to think of and talk about. It's kind of an extended version of a really important conversation. George, did you have specifically somewhere you wanted to go with this, or
No, we can start with some of your experiences that you've had that stuck out to you guys.
I guess good or bad?
Yeah, good or bad. I mean,
I'm an optimist, so I'm going to start off positively.
right on.
So, I love my school, loved where I went. And one of the times that we were talking about Emmett Till, which is a very historical event in our nation's history, and it's a really tragic tale. And the history teacher I was teaching, he's usually just pretty straightforward and all that stuff. He's very passionate, but it's not really just overly joyous or anything like that. But he gets to the story, and like he's almost in tears as he's teaching it. And for me, that just had an impact because I know I don't hold him responsible. I don't think he holds himself responsible either. But knowing that this happened in his country and having a black student in his class like that, that does make me uncomfortable and stuff like that. It's never like, oh yeah, I enjoy talking about slavery in class. It's important that we teach it and that we know about it so we don't make the same mistakes. But knowing that is something that's harmful, and his reaction was to cry about it, and like I thought it helped me. Like I thought that okay, this guy genuinely is empathetic.
It's an acknowledgement.
Yeah, that just the acknowledgement. I appreciate that because I mean, some people's reaction is simply go get educated, go buy a book and get educated, but aren't willing to have the conversation, aren't willing to talk to people about their experiences and stuff like that. It's just there's so much that both sides of this argument can do, where we acknowledge things at the past and that I'm not responsible for them, and rather, we work together in order to educate each other and that we build each other up ultimately in Christ. So I think that's something that's positively I think about almost every day. I love that story.
So. It's really good. What about you, Roy?
Yeah, I just first off, Alexander, I think that's like, I don't know, it touches my heart hearing that, because kind of like what we were talking about before is that you didn't attribute the things happening to your teacher, like you don't hold him responsible for that, but there's just something about people coming across that way still, right? For like, if something's going on, to walk up to a person and say, hey, I'm sorry that this has happened to you, or this is going, you're going through this. Sometimes you're like, you don't have to be sorry, you're not doing this, but it still like means a lot and touches a person. For me, in terms of just, and I think we touched on it a little bit earlier, some of the experiences I've gone through is just people saying really like harsh or hurtful stuff. And normally it's in the name of humor. Like a lot of people are saying, hey, this is going to hit. This is a joke that's going to be hilarious. And so they just say whatever. Or I think sometimes people think they're more comfortable with me than they actually are. But I think a lot of times that's done out of two things, either ignorance or carelessness. Sometimes people will say, hey, I think that this person is being too sensitive about this type of thing. Or on the other hand, they don't understand what they're saying or how they're coming across. So again, being able to inform people on those kind of things is important. Whether you see that going on, it's a person's responsibility to say, hey, don't do that, or hey, you may be coming across this way, or for the receiver to do that. In terms of carelessness, like for someone to intentionally or know that they're making a person feel bad but not care and say, this person is being too insensitive or being too sensitive, it's kind of like we were saying before. I think that's a God in Jesus issue. Like I can't change a person that way, but I know that God can. So I don't know, in the same situation of witnessing that, maybe you should still say something, but then also praying to God that he handles the rest of that and forcing his way into their life and making that change in them is, I think, also really important.
So we touched on it a bit in the condensed version we were just going on the last recording. So we were comparing the response. I guess we're going to keep this as broad and as vague as possible for you guys. I mean, Newman already said, but when someone says all lives matter in response, how should we respond to that if we want them to see the point and not just the organization itself, but like the point and the principle that Black lives do matter? How do we go about explaining that kindly and gently with someone who strongly, like, you know who I'm talking about, the people who are like, it's racist for you to say only Black, they view it as only Black lives matter. How do you guys respond to that?
Well, I think, we were talking about acknowledgement. While we were saying that it shows a lot of compassion when telling someone you're sorry for something that you may not even be entirely responsible for. To not acknowledge a problem that's right in front of everybody comes off as really insensitive. And so I think that's the way that people normally take that, in terms of when someone says, in response to Black Lives Matter, that all lives matter, that you're saying, well, that's not the point, right? The idea is that certain people are struggling with something right now, and overall, right, we want to get rid of the issue altogether. I think a similar thing that kind of helps in this situation is I've had people tell me, there are more people, maybe within a year or whatever, that are brutalized by the police than more white people oppressed by the police than Black people. And it makes me wonder, okay, should my response to that be like, okay, then we're just not going to worry about that anymore? It's the idea is if a bunch of white people are being oppressed by the police, if a bunch of Black people are being oppressed by the police, can we focus on the issue of the police? It's like, are you saying that to just say that that's not something that we should be concerned or worried about? It's the problem. I think it is or being able to acknowledge that there is a problem, acknowledge that problem, I think is the issue there. And it comes off as really insensitive when people don't.
So what if, so you're saying we've said this a lot, acknowledge the problem, and we've mentioned police brutality, so it's out there now. What do we do with people who are like, well, it isn't a problem? Like, police brutality is not a problem, because I'm sure you've all heard this, and I've heard this, well, if they would just stop and listen, you hear that all the time, then they would not have
follow protocol.
Yeah, they would not have been shot or beaten or whatever the case is. How do we reach that for people who are saying there isn't any issue?
I think there's wealth of evidence. I think, if you go through all of the big name cases over the past couple of years, there's some of them that are just like, they really shouldn't be in the news. But there are some clear and obvious incidents where the police were in the wrong in this situation. And like, really focusing on the evidence. I'm not going to spin it either the way that Fox News would or CNN would. I'm going to look at the evidence of what it is, and I'm going to show it to you, and we can go over it together. And if they still get to that point where they're just like, they refuse to acknowledge that this happens, they refuse to acknowledge that there's a genuine problem, you have to just pray for them and leave it up to God, because at the end of the day, the only one who can change hearts is God. We can't do that. All we can do is go to the scripture. We can go and look at evidence together. We can give, Roy and I, we've talked a little bit about personal experiences. We can talk about those a little bit more, expound upon them. But if someone's not willing to listen to everything that has been provided, you can only pray for them, because only God can change their heart.
I think I completely agree. I think, especially in that thing we were talking about before, of people saying, okay, there are more white people dealing with this than Black people. My response to that was, show me, because there's so much that I don't know. And so my response wasn't to fight back against that. It was that may be the case, but I just don't see it. Maybe it's a media thing. Maybe it's just an agenda thing. But I was like, if that's the case, just show me. And so in this same situation, I think we have to do something to show other people, not only, and wanting them to get to acknowledge the issue, but show them the issue if they won't. Kind of like what we were talking before, is that there are definitely things from my own personal experience and a lot of other Black people's personal experience that they share in that is this kind of thing. This isn't new to 2020 or to 21st century. Like, this has been going on for years, and I think that's why it's in the forefront of some Black people's minds, is because they're tired of it. They're saying they have been dealing with this for so long, and that we're tired of it. And so I just think I think that's just something that we have to show them. I know, especially in sharing experiences as well, for someone to say that that's not an issue. It's I could say it's very insensitive for you to say that, because this is something I've experienced myself, and then you share your experience with them. I think that goes a long way, and that says a lot. What is a person going to say to you in response? That's not something that happened. I know that I had to be raised in a certain way because of the things that my parents feared. You know, I remember specifically my mom saying, dude, telling me, or would get upset with me when I would wear my hoodie up outside because I would somehow come across more aggressive, or there'd be something threatening about that. Or if I ever had to deal with the police, or was in a situation like that, to how my parents would tell me to handle that, and to be careful. Like, that's something I can remember as even a really young boy, my parents having to teach me. I don't know if everybody has to go through that, but if you tell a person that, maybe they'll be like, oh, I didn't know that. That's not something I was aware of. But doing something to show them, I guess.
Mhm. People don't really want to be told that they're wrong often. And so it's hard for them. I've had this conversation where people have told me this. How do you, when someone says this, what do you say when they're like, yeah, but you have, everything that we have. You've had a black president. What more do you want? I've had people say that. What's your response to that? I know it's a little deep.
Yeah. Oh no, that's a really good question. I think that the post civil rights era, and getting that out of the way like that, I think that was good, like, naturally. But there have been plenty of policies that have been done in the government in order to denigrate some people of color. There's been some problems with redlining and stuff like that. But at the end of the day, even if we have equality under the law, there are still some people who do not believe that we do. And ultimately, for a Christian to say that to me, you are ignoring Genesis 1:27. You get right to you've somehow skipped that point where I am made in the same image as you are. That means that God has given me the same rights as you. So yeah, there may be some problems with the government and how they've treated our citizens and whatever. But for a Christian, your diagnosis does not come from the government. The situation you're in does not come from the government. It comes from God. So when we get to whatever position, cool, we had a black president, cool. I still expect you to respect me because I respect you, and God has given his life for me. So why would you, I don't know why you would use that as an answer. I think that's just, again, going back to scripture, going back to this is a dignity that God has given to me. That should be the answer to every question.
Yeah, more than a race issue. Like, I like how Newman's emphasizing Jesus obviously, died for everyone. This is like, this is a blood issue at that point, because everyone's supposed to be, viewed and united with Christ, no matter the skin color. So it's more of a blood issue than a race one. What are we saying about God's view of people when we view people or treat people in ways we want to be treated just because they look different? Roy, you looked like you wanted to say something on that.
Just a little bit. I think Newman hit it really well, but I think people, it's again kind of hitting on that defensive-ness that we were talking about before, in terms of maybe someone individually hasn't done anything to add to the issue, but they still need to have that compassion, that care, and that outreach. The ways I think, especially in coming across in a way to where you don't have to offend anybody and don't have to outright call people, oh no, well, you're just wrong, is maybe not trying to get people to understand the situation of, okay, no, it's not that you've necessarily been given more than I have, or that we may have access to the same things, but you've never had to be held back because of who you are. In terms of reparations, in terms of things like that, I feel like the African American community has felt like it's had to work its way back up from racism and other things throughout history that maybe a white person that hasn't necessarily had to, whether it be the people being the product of their situation, the communities that they're raised in, or where they're coming from. Is not necessarily saying that you have more than I do, but that you've never been held back for who you are. So I hope that would be a way to come across to help someone maybe understand that, and maybe in a less offensive way, or one that would make them make someone come across as or would keep someone from being super defensive in that situation. I hope, it says
Right.
outright just calling them wrong.
Well, you've opened at least in Caleb's mind, because I've had similar conversations where Christians and the topics out there, usually white Christians, are struggling with the concept of systemic racism. Because Roy, I think you kind of worked your way into there by saying, well, just basic facts and history. You said the African American community at large, just generally speaking, feels like it's been held back. Whether you can go back to Jim Crow laws, or obviously all the way back to the days of slavery. So, how would you guys define systemic racism in the sense of where is it correctly defined? Where do you think possibly it gets incorrectly defined, and how should Christians view that? Because that's like a triggering word for people when we hear systemic racism. Thoughts?
So systemic racism naturally is a racism that comes in the system, in the way that the government operates and works, that they are doing something particularly to a group of people that disenfranchises them. I think the examples of systemic racism as we get to this era, I think that they are less. I think, honestly, the racism that comes is usually from a single politician in the way that they treat someone, or from just other people in general. So I think that there's plenty to be done, but like I think a lot of systemic racism has come before this time, when it came to things, again, like redlining, how you make a district so that you keep off the impoverished people, the darker people down here, and
Right.
purify your other districts and stuff like that. So there's plenty of examples. I don't think it's the most dangerous form of racism at all, but I think it's a real one.
I think I agree with Newman in terms of systemic being, in the system, but being on a lot of different levels of social. I think financially, and kind of like Newman was saying, also politically, in terms of I think the way that people think that they would the minorities are gathered in districts, or I guess low income areas, in ways that they feel like they can't get out of such things, like they're caught in a hole in that way. I think a lot of people feel that same way with schooling, in the way that people have to go to certain areas. In that sense, I think people feel that the African American community, or even other minorities as well, are held back in that sense, and that they may not have all the same opportunities as other people. But I think that relates a lot to what Newman was saying, that might be maybe more directed towards like individual politicians and things like that. But in terms of systemic racism, that's the first place that mine goes.
What is the most prominent type of racism do we see in the church? You were talking about the different types. What do we see in the church when it comes to things like that? Is it just systemic, or is it outright, prejudice against someone else? What's the degree, and what is it?
In the church, I would definitely say social, in my opinion, or from my experience. So one thing that has always been prominent in my life is my parents have always been afraid that me and my sister were going to be, I wouldn't acknowledge racism when we see it. Like we were saying before, I don't think racism is something that people are supporting for, or that everybody's like pushing for nowadays. And so if someone did have any kind of feelings towards that way, it would come across a lot more subtly. And so in that sense, my parents, I think, were feared that we wouldn't be able to recognize that when that was right in front of us, when someone was treating us differently because of the color of our skin, that they were doing it in such a subtle way that we wouldn't be able to recognize that. And so I think in my own experience, I think that people, to make sure that they're not just letting that happen, I think a lot of minorities look for that. And so while sometimes I think that can be found, I think in other situations, the church has to be careful that isn't taken the wrong way. So let me give you an example. is, like I said, I worship in Black congregations for most of my life. And it wasn't until high school that I worshiped at a congregation that was majority white. And it was culturally different. I didn't know how to dress. And the Black congregations I'd worshiped at, what you wore in the morning, you wore at night. And so if I was wearing a collared shirt and a tie and slacks and all, I would just wear that as night as well. If I wore a suit in the morning, I'm wearing a suit at night. However, at this majority white congregation, especially because it was in the Midwest, people dressed down just a little bit for evening worship, and I didn't know what to wear. And so I would model myself after other people. If they wore something, I would wear something. And I guess I just know better now, but at the time I wouldn't wear this, but I had worn a undershirt, a white undershirt, kind of like what I'm wearing now, but with a white undershirt that was open. But the only reason that I wore that is because I'd seen other people wear that while serving on the table, because I didn't know how to dress in the first place. But someone walked up to me and kind of tore me apart after worship. They're saying, hey, you got an outfit or there's a uniform for everything, right? And you don't want to look like you just woken up, or, like that, you're just walking the dog. And my feelings were hurt. I remember sitting there and just slowly buttoning up my shirt as they're talking to me, holding back the tears. But even in high school, yeah, even in high school, like my mindset went in the direction of, okay, I was modeling myself after other people. What is it that made you think that you can say that to me, but you couldn't or didn't say that to them, especially because I'm never doing that again, but I would see them do that again and no one say anything or talk to them. And so in terms of that, what if I'm looking at them and saying, what's the difference between us that's going to make you feel like you can say something like that to me, or you can talk to me or correct me, but not them? That's the first place that my mind's going to go. So whether that's the reason that they did that or not, I think that's something that people have to be conscious of. I mean, to this day, I don't recognize why that was the case, so maybe I'm being unreasonable, maybe I'm not. But at the same time, my parents would always also come across the same way. Is they'd say sometimes they would worry about, racial issues in the church. And I would say, what make you think that way? And they just worship at congregations where they felt like there are people who talk to everybody but them. And they said, to this day, I've been a member there for 4 years or more than that. And this individual or this family or these people never approached me. They never greeted me. They never said anything to me. And if they felt like they did that to the majority of the church, but not them, what are they going to attribute that to? You're treating everybody else differently from how you're treating me. What's different about me from everybody else? That's the way that people's minds go. And so whether they meant for it to come across that way, I think you can understand how someone could take that. But that's from my experience. I hope that helps understand like how you could see that socially in the church. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Sometimes silence is deafening, like you're saying, regardless what you mean. And we have to go out of our way to make sure everyone feels loved. Newman, did you have a thought based off of what he was saying?
Yeah. And that's so systemic racism, like in the church, I don't know of any examples of a guy who's like rejected from a congregation for the simple fact that he's Black. I don't know of that. Maybe it's happening.
Right.
But again, as Roy was pointing out, it's very much like a bigoted attitude in some ways, the way almost a double standard type of thing. I remember seeing naturally over the past summer when these things were going on, a friend of mine made a post, and in the comments of this post that was talking about how some group of religious people came to his door, and they had this belief about them being Black men. They had this belief that they were worth less than white people. And the preacher's like, of course that's not true. Like, God views you equally. And then someone puts in the comments who, worships at a congregation very similar to one that I worship at. And his comment was, well, of course, Black people have smaller brains and are, built more athletically and all this type of stuff. And it was just kind of like he sits in the pew next to somebody. And we haven't done enough to address that this is a wrong way of thinking. So it's not a universal problem, but there are some things that the older generation has perpetrated on the younger generations, and they just held on to that instead of learning for themselves, or we've been teaching it differently. So it's just kind of this really weird position that people are in, but it's very much a person-to-person basis. You can't generalize the church and say that they're all broken like this, but there are definitely people who have slipped through the cracks of how we handle these sorts of issues.
Yeah, and that's interesting because, as we've said, for like the fourth time now, 99, maybe even 99.5 or 9% of people, especially people who are Christians, aren't going to be like, yeah, white power, or even black power. Like no one's viewing that way. But the fact of the matter is, we've picked up some stories where there are some certain individuals, again, small minority, but certain individuals who definitely have some very unchristlike, unbiblical, bigoted kind of thinking. That's making me think of this. Growing up in a predominantly white congregation, I want to hear if you heard this, Roy, or not. I mean, I guess ask George, the other white guy here. George, how many sermons did you hear growing up about racism? Zero. I think I think zero for myself too. I can think of later in high school where maybe in passing in a sermon it brought up, I'm like, this is why racism's bad or evil or whatever. And like that's fine. But I don't know if I ever heard a sermon growing up that addressed the topic of racism. Now, Roy, you were saying most of your life you're in a predominantly black congregation. Was it different? Was racism talked more about and addressed in the churches you grew up at?
Yes. And I guess I wouldn't say, right, because I feel like a lot of times people wouldn't give a sermon on racism because they maybe thought, we're not dealing with racists. Like we don't need to teach people that racism is wrong. But in terms of a black congregation, in terms of things about African Americans in history and civil rights and things like that are definitely going to come up in a sermon. Things that are involved, deeply involved in black culture, the things that come up in a sermon. And so I would definitely, I guess I would say in several sermons, I'd heard things that you would expect from a conversation on racism, things that apply to black people and black culture for sure. So.
Newman, you growing up was, because it sounded like we were talking before we recorded, you have your home congregation in Embry Hills in Atlanta, you had a pretty real diverse group. Were conversations different there at all, or
Yeah, the only experience that I don't remember personally having a sermon on it, and maybe it's kind of like we had so many people of different cultures at this congregation, don't need to talk about it. Like clearly we got to figure it out or something like that. But I do remember a few people who would come and either complain to my dad about this person is acting in this way, or we don't have a black X, therefore you are excluding them, or this congregation is racist because you don't include a black X. So I think that there's I don't know. I didn't experience a problem. Again, I mentioned that I didn't experience a problem with it, but it wasn't talked about openly, other than in private conversations behind closed doors. So.
And are you saying you'd like it to be more public, or are you saying it was handled great there, in the sense of there was what's your opinion?
I think that we need to bring it out to light. It's a sin. Sin's a sin, and we've done a lot to, at least from my opinion, we overemphasize some of these things that are very culturally I don't know, the LGBTQ plus issue. That is very much we push that. We're this is obviously a sin. This is obviously wrong. But then it's we let racism kind of slip in under it. We just we don't think about it. So if we're gonna talk about sin and call sin what it is, that we need to repent from it and turn to Jesus in it, that means racism needs to be a part of that conversation. So I think it needs to be out there.
One thing that I remember specifically my dad talking to me about is that one thing that he said he appreciated at the congregation that they worship at is in the light of the things that have been going on recently. He said that the evangelist there, while he did acknowledge the problem, he also didn't acknowledge that he didn't speak as if he knew other people's experiences entirely, right? He could speak for all black people, all minorities or people everywhere. And I think a lot of people appreciate that. I think that's just worth saying is coming across in a way where you're I can't speak. I'll acknowledge that there's a problem. I'm willing to listen or, take this receiving position of what you have to tell me or what you have to say. and not necessarily speak for other people, or in other people's situation that you may not understand or may not experience yourself. But on the subject of what we're talking about now, I'm just saying that might be while that's not the case, right? Maybe someone doesn't feel, or maybe there's just a majority of people in less diverse congregations or majority white congregations that don't want to step on toes or say the wrong thing or speak for other people. Maybe that's why that's happening there, but that just a guess from my part.
This may be going too far out of topic, but when it comes to the church again and evangelizing, how do we evangelize to the Black community as
Yeah, because like obviously, we're not going to treat it like just solely because someone isn't white, like we have to get to them. Like you might live in a place like where we are in West Texas, and in your community you might only have so many contacts in there, but like we're looking right now at Pew Research Center and just raw facts on the racial composition of members in the Churches of Christ. And according to their sample here, 69% are white, 16% Black, 1% Asian, 10% Latino, and then 4% is in the other category. I guess we might end up going back to Acts 10 here. How are we supposed to be able to reach people who don't think like us, look like us, talk like us, vote like us? What can we do better as a church in that way?
I think making an effort to understand things that you obviously wouldn't goes a long way. I remember talking to a man who'd done a lot of missionary work I think in Africa, and he'd learned some of the languages over there. And so he talked about how blown away people were when they would hear a white man talking to these Black people in their native language. And it probably was somewhat reminiscent of Acts 2, people just blown away by something going on. Like they just felt, they probably would feel God a lot from that. But I'm sure you've also heard other stories in terms of just people traveling the world. I took Chinese in high school, and the one thing our Chinese teacher told us is that if you go to China and you're trying to buy something from someone as a tourist or as a foreigner, if you speak English, they're automatically going to charge you more than they would if you spoke in Chinese to them. And so people of different cultures appreciate when you make an effort to share their culture. And I think that same thing would go a long way in terms of evangelism, whether it's just making an effort to reach out to people who are different than you, or in the evangelism effort, somehow showing that you appreciate them, you appreciate their culture, you appreciate what makes them different. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah. I think a part of it also is looking in the past history of how the church has handled issues of race, and being an acknowledgement that there were some bad things that were done in the name of Christ, in the name of the Lord, but they do not apply to how we're actually supposed to. Like, you can look through the scripture and see that what they were doing was clearly and obviously wrong. So I think having at least some semblance, just read a few books or anything like that. As a matter of fact, that's something I'm doing right now, is trying to gain a better understanding of the history of the Black churches. And it's like, so that this wasn't forced upon you by white people. Like, this is the truth is the truth. So getting to that part of it, and just being willing to show compassion in situations like these, because a lot of these people who are in these communities feel like they've been neglected, like they feel that they've been oppressed by the government and stuff like that. And very often that's true. And the reality for them is that Jesus came to help out the oppressed and the needy and the weary, and to provide them rest. That is an appealing message, and that's a true message. That's who Jesus came to. That the people who are called in the kingdom are the people who are lame and weak and all this other stuff. So stop propping up this idea of, Christianity is a religion for those who have it all together, but it's really for the people who are broken down and the people who have been overlooked by the rest of the world. I think that has a big impact.
It's interesting where you started there, saying the bad things being done in the name of Christ. Like, Sounds like there's more than one way to take God's name in vain than just with words, but also actions for sure. That's something to think about. And then the second half, where we just went, I think we really, I mean, it's easy for us to forget who Christ, I mean, obviously Christ came for everyone, but as you just pointed out, the emphasis on the poor and the needy and the lame in our Western American culture, I mean, we just skip over that. And that's what Roy talked about a bit too, where we start speaking for other people's experiences.
Yeah.
Right. Well, it's great for me, so it must be great for everyone else. Man, now this conversation is about to go a bunch of ways now. I'm trying to think of
Go a different way.
which way to take it. Were you about
well,
to say something?
No.
All right.
Before we go off on any like other tangents, something that just came to my mind is maybe talking about the hard topics. And I think this is something that came to my mind from, the question that you asked, Caleb, of how many sermons have we heard on racism. There are a couple of hard topics that that as I'm thinking about now, that I don't know if I've heard a sermon on, that are probably things that people sit on that prevents them from diving into the word. For example, especially if you're trying to evangelize to people of a minority or Black people, right? It's like slavery is something that is in the Bible. And a lot of, I think a lot of Black people, and we've had this discussion before, see Christianity as the white man's religion. And that's just a misconception, and it's just not true. And so some of these things that people that we, say we'd appreciate if people acknowledge some of these things as issues, look into the Bible and saying, hey, this isn't a misogynistic book. Let me teach you or tell you why. Looking at the Bible and saying, hey, the Bible doesn't support slavery, or at least not in the way that you think. And let me teach you and tell you why. It can show people, hey, these are issues, and they're issues in the Bible, and the Bible addresses them and handles them in a certain way. And it doesn't stand for these situations of injustice, and neither will I. So talking about maybe those certain things and teaching people a couple misconceptions they have about the Bible may be important in terms of evangelizing. Let them get some of the things that they're sitting on or stopping them, and especially in terms of racial issues.
Really good. It's at times of peace. You both brought up talking about these and things are peaceful, because to us it's like we're so far removed from Jim Crow in the 60s, which is not that long ago, or we're so far removed from slavery and the slave trade in the 17 and 1800s, which in the long scheme of things isn't horribly long ago. I mean, you think about what the Japanese did to the Koreans and Chinese in World War II. You think about, obviously, the Holocaust comes to mind. That was pretty racially motivated. I think it's really arrogant of us to think that like this couldn't be a huge problem because it's seemingly foreign to us. But as we've all alluded to, if we don't view other people as people who Jesus died for, that's another form of selfishness and sin of, if I have to prop myself up by putting someone else who talks or looks differently than I do, thank you very much, I'm going to do that. And like we have to address that, even when, as we've said, in times of peace. Our preacher Nate here, he talks about when it comes to unity, we need to preach how to deal with unity and hard issues when times are peaceful, because that way we're establishing the groundwork. I think the same can be said for anything, but especially the topic of racism has to be talked about even when the times are good.
I mean, yeah. I don't have too much to say.
Is that our background? I'm not gonna hear it. So I'm trying to figure out. Yeah, sorry, I had to step away. That like in the original recording, I was trying to make sure sometimes we got kids, people come and clean up the church. I was really grateful for that. It was getting loud out there. They felt really bad. I wasn't trying to make them feel bad.
It's all good. It gives the podcast character, man.
Yeah, sure. Any other topics or questions or things you guys are thinking of right now you want to hit on?
I feel like I had a thought, but then I lost it. So
I think the only thing that I really want to emphasize is I don't want this to be like a white guilt thing, where I'm accusing all white people of the sin of segregation, the sin of slavery, because it's not your responsibility. God doesn't hold you accountable for the sins of your fathers. We read that in the scripture itself. And I think that when you do enforce this culture of like, let's talk about racism, cool. But the danger is always that we overemphasize it too much to the point that um, now black people are the ones who are in power, and then the white people are the people who are in, you know, the minority in some sense, that you are responsible for these things. And the way I put it is that this is going to be this constant pendulum swing between who has power when it comes to these races, because when we try to handle it through government solutions, so we try to handle it through segregating, like people are talking about segregating again. It's ridiculous. You go through these issues and it's like, let me handle it this way. Let me handle it this way. It has never worked. The only thing that's going to stop this pendulum swing is the gospel. So I think it's really important for us to emphasize that, you know, I love all my white brothers and sisters. I love all my brothers and sisters in Jesus. And I'm not saying this that we need to talk about racism to beat you guys down. I think we need to talk about this so that we love each other the way we're supposed to be called to. So not enforcing this culture of guilt is not the way that Jesus would want us to do. And I think that's important too.
I think also maybe coming in at this with a softer hand, I probably should have at the beginning. Maybe it's not an issue of like hate and complete separation or like straight up racism, but like us being distant or separated or divided. Maybe it's not a huge issue of that, but us being not as close as we should be. You know, I think one thing that we've said a lot is, you know, I don't think the issue of the church is people being racist, but maybe it's in terms of people's comfort and how comfortable they are. You know, for one thing, we're talking about division and unity. People divide and separate over the things that they prioritize. And, you know, we're talking about the image and the message, the example that we give off. If you come from like my experience, you know, where you have a lot of congregations that are organized by race, and that's something that you're going to witness, especially if you're an unbeliever or not a Christian. You're saying all these congregations are gathered by race. Their priority is culture and race. You know, that could be a problem. On the other hand, you know, it just goes a long way to show people, because for example, I think, you know, not everybody is a racist, but I think there's still some things that people need to get more comfortable with. I think at some point in our lives that we can all say that when we closed our eyes and pictured our future and pictured our grandchildren and stuff, we weren't picturing some kind of mixed child, you know, and I probably pictured a black kid because I'm black. I identify that with who I am, you know, and maybe that's something that we need to start thinking about or envisioning more. And I don't think that makes somebody racist, but I think that makes that may be a situation that someone has to learn to get more comfortable with or expect or get used to. You know, I can be a Christian or dealing with another Christian, not say or have to straight up tell someone that they hate me, but someone will feel upset if you portray in some way that you're not comfortable being around them or not comfortable worshiping with them, or if they're Christian and you're a Christian, that you can't identify with them completely in that same way. That doesn't feel good. It may not be straight up racism to them, but it's something, and it's not as close as people should be in that situation. And so maybe that's something that a lot more people who are listening to this or will listen to this can identify with more, is maybe you aren't as close with people who are of a different culture or race of you, and you want to be. And that may be the approach that we need to think about that or take that from, is that the image that we see of heaven is an assembly of people from all different kinds of nations and places and cultures and times. And if the church doesn't, you know, if the church is looking more like that, we're looking to more like the way that heaven should be and the way that God intended to be and the way that he wants it to be. And kind of going back to what we were talking about before, is that the ideal of the future is a church that looks more like the way it's meant to be. It's supposed to be in heaven. And I would think that that'd be a truly diverse one, or one of people being so different. So
I heard a preacher one time say, and this is any relationship, it's your marriage, it's someone who may have the same skin color as you, and you just have aught with them. And of course, as we're talking about right now, when it comes to race and relationships with Christians with race, he was like, if you can't get along with them or love them here on earth, what makes you think you're going to do that for eternity? And I was like, ooh. He's like, I think you were about to say something, George.
No, that's really good. I was going to say what Roy said was a great way to wrap it up. But yeah, you kind of ruined it. No,
I'm sorry. Well, thanks for sticking around for an extended version of a tough but much needed conversation.
Yeah, thank you guys. It's nice meeting you guys as well. I appreciate it.
It's great meeting you, George. Really glad we had this conversation. I really enjoyed this.
Yeah, I think we should continue doing it too. It'll be good.
Yeah, we have
future
to have-
episodes.
Yeah,
Be really good.
that would be nice. I mean, one day we'll all get together in person.
That's right.
There you go.
Yeah.
There you go. All right. God
All right.
bless, guys. Thanks for talking.
See you.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.